So let's talk about the main motif of the dying and rising god, the storyline. Dying and rising god myths are primarily defined by their storyline, really more than any of the other myths that you have read or you will read this semester. And the storyline is pretty identical in every single dying and rising god myth. The god king or the goddess, because sometimes dying and rising gods are female, dies and is revived. And that revival might be metaphorically, as in Adonis dies and then comes back in the form of flowers, or literally, like we see with Wanjiru and also Persephone. In doing so, the dead god becomes a seed that's planted in Earth, Mother Earth. So Adonis's blood and semen are seeped into the ground, and he comes back as flowers. But sometimes Mother Earth is represented in other ways. For example, although this is not in your reading, Odin was hanged on a tree. Jesus is crucified on a cross. And so the presence of Earth is symbolized at times by trees or plants or flowers. And sometimes Earth is Earth, and the dead god's body sinks into the ground, like Wanjiru does, or like Persephone does. She goes underground. The Earth, or another great goddess, facilitates the revival or the renewal or the resurrection of our dying and rising god. So in the case of Adonis, Aphrodite is the other great goddess who allows Adonis to come back as in the form of flowers. The dead god then is associated with revival. Even if he himself doesn't physically return to the realm of the living, like Osiris, who has to remain in the underworld as the god of the dead, nonetheless, they aren't just about death. They are also about renewal, revival, about rebirth as well. So as we think about these myths and what they're all about, you should consider some of the other motifs of the dying rising god in addition to the storyline. You should note that dying rising gods often feature pretty prominently trees, flowers, wood of some kind, or a branch of some kind, and that is often associated with both the god's death and also the god's life. Often there's loss of genitals and or blood. Then that's because dying and rising god stories are fundamentally also about fertility. They are the metaphorical seed that's planted in the earth and then germinates and is fertilized and becomes a plant. So genitalia is associated with that idea of fertility. Rebirth or resurrection is necessary. If your god just dies and the resurrection or rebirth doesn't happen, then you don't have a dying and rising god. Flowers, plants, and trees are also associated with the god's rebirth. And this is where we really tend to see flowers and plants. So the corn mother is reborn again in the form of corn plants. And also, dying and rising gods are the only gods who die for the sake of others. Later, you'll read about heroes. And one of the things I want to make clear is that heroes never die to save other people. That's not the definition of a mythological hero, but it is the definition of a mythological dying and rising god. Next, we're going to start talking about some of the functions of these myths.